Samuel answered as best he could, but his mind was already racing ahead. The sentence of community service wasn't just a punishment, it was an opportunity to connect with the people he had fought for, to understand their struggles on a deeper level, and to continue the fight for systemic change. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan remained in his chambers, staring out the window at the bustling city below. The verdict he had delivered weighed heavily on him, not because he doubted it, but because it had forced him to confront his own complacency. For years, he had adhered strictly to the letter of the law, shutting out the voices that cried for its reform. But Samuel Parker's case had cracked something open within him, a realization that the law could not exist in a vacuum, detached from the lives it governed. That night, Brennan sat at his desk, poring over case files and policy documents with a newfound sense of purpose. He thought about the families displaced by housing policies, the children sleeping in shelters, the mothers working multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. The system wasn't perfect, far from it, but perhaps there was a way to push it toward fairness without abandoning its foundations. As Samuel began his community service, working alongside volunteers at shelters and advocacy organizations, he saw firsthand the depth of the crisis he had tried to highlight in court. The stories he heard were heartbreaking, but they also fueled his determination. He began drafting proposals, rallying local leaders, and building coalitions to address the root causes of the housing crisis. The revelation, for both Samuel and Judge Brennan, was clear. Justice was not a fixed point, but a constant pursuit. It required empathy, courage, and the willingness to challenge the status quo. And as their paths continued to intersect in unexpected ways, both men found themselves united in that pursuit, striving not just to interpret the law, but to transform it into a true instrument of justice. Judge Harold Brennan sat alone in his chambers late into the night, the quiet hum of the city faintly audible through the thick glass of his office windows. The court's proceedings from earlier that day played on a loop in his mind. It was an unrelenting reel of Samuel Parker's words, the passion in his voice, and the undeniable truths he had laid bare about the housing crisis. For years, Brennan had prided himself on his strict adherence to the letter of the law, a steadfast belief that his role was to interpret, not to reform. But today had shaken him to his core. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the certificates and plaques that adorned his office walls. Symbols of his accomplishments, his commitment to justice. But were they truly meaningful, if they were tethered to a system that so often failed the people it was meant to serve? Samuel Parker's arguments had pierced through Brennan's carefully constructed walls, leaving him with an unsettling realization. Justice wasn't always found in the black and white text of legal codes. Brennan reached for the case file that had been presented in court earlier that day. Flipping through the pages, he revisited the facts. Samuel Parker had broken into a government office, not for personal gain, but to expose records that revealed the extent of the housing crisis. The evidence was irrefutable. Displacement numbers were staggering, families were being uprooted, and entire communities were being dissolved under the weight of unyielding policies. The judge frowned, his fingers brushing over a photograph stapled to one of the pages. It was a picture of a single mother and her 2 children, all 3 huddled together in a cramped shelter. The children's eyes held a mix of innocence and awe, a stark reminder of the real lives impacted by abstract policies. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a human tragedy. For years, Brennan had sat on the bench, delivering verdicts with precision and impartiality. He had told himself that his job wasn't to fix the world's problems, only to interpret the laws as they were written. But as he stared at the photograph, a question gnawed at him. Could neutrality in the face of injustice be considered justice at all? The next morning, Brennan arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. He bypassed his usual routine of coffee and quiet reflection, heading straight to the clerk's office instead. "I need the housing policy documents," he said brusquely, startling the clerk. "Which ones, Your Honor?" the clerk asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "All of them," Brennan replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Every policy, every amendment, every report related to housing in this district over the last 10 years. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It'll take some time to gather everything." "It'll wait," Brennan said firmly. Hours later, surrounded by stacks of documents, Brennan began his deep dive into the housing crisis. Page after page revealed a troubling pattern. Policies that favored developers over residents, loopholes that allowed landlords to exploit tenants, and a glaring lack of support for low-income families. The judge felt a knot of anger tighten in his chest. How had this been allowed to happen? And more importantly, how had he, a man sworn to uphold justice, failed to see it? That afternoon, Brennan called his longtime friend and retired legal mentor, Judge Eleanor Carver. "Eleanor, do you have a moment?" he asked when she picked up. "For you." "Always," she replied warmly. "What's on your mind?" Brennan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever felt constrained by the law, as though following it to the letter might sometimes betray the spirit of justice?" Carver chuckled softly. "Harold, that's the eternal struggle. F.A. Judge. The law is our guide, but it's not infallible. It's made by people, and people are flawed. But what do we do when the law itself is the problem?" Brennan pressed. Carver's voice turned serious. "We push back where we can. We question, we challenge, and when possible, we influence change. A judge's job doesn't end at the bench, Harold. Sometimes it's what we do outside the courtroom that matters most." Her words lingered with Brennan long after their conversation ended. That evening, as he sat in his study, he began drafting a letter. It was addressed to the local council, urging a review of the district's housing policies. In it, he outlined the systemic issues he had uncovered, calling for immediate reforms to protect vulnerable families. The next week, Brennan visited a local shelter. It was uncharacteristic of him to step beyond the confines of his role, but he felt compelled to see the reality for himself. The shelter director, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret, greeted him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "What brings a judge to our little corner of the world?" she asked, folding her arms. "I need to understand," Brennan replied simply. Margaret led him through the shelter, introducing him to residents and sharing their stories. There was Daniel, a former factory worker who had lost his home after being laid off. Maria, a mother of 3 who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't afford rent, and Jamal, a teenager who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. Each story chipped away at Brennan's sense of detachment, replacing it with a burning resolve. These weren't just statistics in a report, they were people, each with their own hopes, dreams, and struggles. Back at the courthouse, Brennan's transformation didn't go unnoticed. His rulings became more nuanced, his questions more probing. He started challenging attorneys to consider the broader implications of their cases, urging them to think beyond the immediate legalities. Some colleagues whispered that he was becoming an activist in robes, but Brennan didn't care. He knew he was finally living up to the true spirit of his oath. Meanwhile, Samuel Parker was fulfilling his community service sentence at the shelter Brennan had visited. The 2 men crossed paths one evening, their conversation beginning tentatively, but soon deepening into mutual respect. "I never thought I'd say this," Samuel admitted, "but your verdict might have been the best thing that could have happened. It's given me a chance to connect with the people I was fighting for in a way I hadn't before." "And you've given me a new perspective," Brennan replied. "You reminded me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people." As weeks turned into months, Brennan's efforts began to bear fruit. The council launched an inquiry into the district's housing policies, spurred in part by his letter and public outcry. New initiatives were introduced to protect tenants, provide affordable housing, and support low-income families. It was far from a complete solution, but it was a start. For Brennan, the journey wasn't just about reforming the system, it was about reforming himself. He realized that true justice required more than impartiality. It required empathy, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And in embracing those qualities, he found a renewed sense of purpose, not just as a judge, but as a human being. Months after the courtroom showdown between Judge Harold Brennan and Samuel Parker, the ripples of their encounter were still spreading. For Samuel, the community service sentence had been a chance to not only fulfill his obligations, but to amplify his mission. For Brennan, it had been the catalyst for a profound shift in his approach to justice, one that would have consequences far beyond that single case. Samuel Parker had always believed in the power of activism, but his time working in the shelter changed him. It wasn't just about the systemic failures anymore. It was about the faces behind those failures. Each day brought him closer to the people he had been fighting for, families displaced by policies, individuals crushed under the weight of bureaucracy, and children forced to grow up too soon. The experience gave Samuel a new perspective. He had once thought that exposing injustice was enough, that pointing out the cracks in the system would lead to change. But now he realized that change required more than just awareness. It required action, solutions, and a commitment to rebuilding what had been broken. During his evenings, Samuel began organizing workshops at the shelter, teaching residents about their legal rights. He guided them on navigating the often opaque systems of housing and public aid. Word spread quickly, and soon the workshops became a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against the machine of bureaucracy. In time, Samuel collaborated with advocacy groups and local activists to push for reforms. He drafted proposals for tenant protections and affordable housing initiatives, leveraging his legal expertise and the connections he had cultivated as a barrister. What had begun as a court-mandated punishment became a personal mission, one that reignited Samuel's sense of purpose and solidified his role as both an activist and an advocate. For Judge Harold Brennan, the consequences of his decision were less public, but equally transformative. The courtroom, once his sanctuary, now felt like a crucible, a place where his every ruling carried the weight of lives and futures. He no longer saw his role as merely interpreting the law. He saw it as an opportunity to question and, where necessary, challenge the system. The housing policies in his district became a focal point for Brennan's renewed efforts. With the council inquiry underway, he provided testimony that detailed his findings and experiences from Samuel's case. His words carried weight, not because of their legal authority, but because they came from a man who had seen firsthand the human cost of bureaucratic indifference. Brennan's actions didn't come without resistance. Some of his colleagues criticized him for stepping outside the bounds of his judicial role, accusing him of activism. Others quietly supported him, recognizing the courage it took to address issues that many in their profession preferred to ignore. But Brennan didn't let the criticism deter him. He knew that meaningful change was rarely welcomed by those who benefited from the status quo. Despite the progress being made, the efforts of both Samuel and Brennan faced significant pushback. Landlords associations and property developers lobbied aggressively against the proposed reforms, arguing that increased regulations would stifle business and discourage investment in the housing market. Some members of the local government, influenced by these interests, sought to stall the council's inquiry. The media played its part in stoking the flames. Samuel was painted by some outlets as a reckless agitator, his protest framed as an act of defiance rather than a cry for justice. Judge Brennan, too, became a target, with critics accusing him of abandoning his impartiality and using his position to push a personal agenda. But amidst the noise, there were voices of support. Advocacy groups rallied behind Samuel and Brennan, organizing campaigns to highlight the housing crisis and the need for reform. Journalists who delved deeper into the story uncovered the stark realities of displacement and exploitation, shifting public opinion in favor of change. The case and its aftermath began to inspire others. Judges in neighboring districts started questioning the housing policies in their jurisdictions. Lawyers who had once viewed activism as outside the scope of their profession began reconsidering their roles. Even within the shelter where Samuel worked, the residents found a renewed sense of hope, realizing that their voices could no longer be ignored. For Brennan, the ripple effect extended to his courtroom. His rulings became more nuanced, more focused on the broader implications of justice. He began encouraging attorneys to present cases with an eye towards systemic impact, challenging them to think beyond their clients and consider the communities affected by their arguments. Samuel, meanwhile, found himself in demand as both an advocate and a speaker. His workshops expanded beyond the shelter, reaching community centers and schools. He was invited to speak at legal conferences, where he shared his experiences and insights on the intersection of activism and the law. He became a bridge between two worlds, the grassroots movement for justice and the legal system that often seemed indifferent to it. While their efforts brought about change, the journey was not without sacrifice. Samuel's relentless drive to fight for others left little time for himself. Late nights drafting proposals, constant meetings with advocacy groups, and the emotional toll of witnessing so much suffering began to weigh on him. There were moments when he questioned whether it was all worth it, whether one person could truly make a difference. For Brennan, the personal toll was different, but no less profound. He found himself alienated from some of his peers, who viewed his new approach as a departure from tradition. The whispers in the hallways of the courthouse were hard to ignore, and there were moments when he felt the loneliness of standing on principle. Yet both men drew strength from the people they were helping. For every criticism they faced, there were stories of lives changed, of families who found stability, of individuals who regained their dignity. These victories, however small, reminded them why they had chosen to fight. Months turned into years, and the reforms that Samuel and Brennan had fought for began to take shape. The council passed new regulations that provided stronger protections for tenants and increased funding for affordable housing. Shelters received additional resources, allowing them to expand their services and reach more people in need. Samuel and Brennan's paths continued to intersect, their shared mission forging a bond between them. Though they came from different backgrounds and perspectives, their collaboration became a testament to the power of unity in the face of injustice. In the end, the consequences of their actions were far-reaching. They had not only sparked change within their community, but had also challenged the broader legal system to rethink its priorities. The ripple effects of their efforts were felt far beyond the walls of the courtroom and the shelter, inspiring others to take up the mantle of justice. As Samuel stood on the steps of the courthouse one sunny afternoon, surrounded by supporters and reporters, he reflected on how far they had come. Beside him, Judge Brennan watched quietly, a faint smile playing on his lips. It wasn't the end of the journey. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long while, both men felt a sense of hope. They had faced the consequences of their choices, and in doing so, they had helped create a world where justice wasn't just an abstract concept, but a lived reality for the people who needed it most. It was a brisk autumn morning when Samuel Parker found himself once again standing on the steps of the Berm, Ingham Courthouse. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the early sun cast long shadows across the square. A small crowd had gathered supporters, reporters, and curious onlookers, all waiting for Samuel to speak. This time, he wasn't here as a defendant. He wasn't here to defend himself or plead a case. He was here to mark the culmination of a journey that had started months ago, a journey that had tested him, shaped him, and ultimately changed him. Standing nearby was Judge Harold Brennan, observing quietly. He had not come to the courthouse in any official capacity that day. Instead, he had come to bear witness. In the months since Samuel's case, their paths had crossed many times, at council hearings, community events, and even at the shelter where Samuel had served his sentence. Through their shared efforts, they had forged an unlikely bond, one built on mutual respect and a shared vision of justice. Samuel stepped up to the makeshift podium, glancing at the faces in the crowd. Some were familiar residents from the shelter, advocates he had worked alongside, and even a few of his former colleagues from the bar. Others were strangers, drawn by the media coverage of the reforms he and Brennan had championed. He adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for being here today," Samuel began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "When I first stood in this courthouse, I wasn't sure what would come of my actions. I knew I had broken the law, and I was prepared to face the consequences. What I didn't know was how much those consequences would teach me not just about the system I had fought against, but about the power of community and the importance of perseverance." He paused, scanning the crowd. The journey that brought us here today wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments of frustration, and moments when it felt like we were fighting an uphill battle. But through it all, one thing remained clear. Justice is not something that happens by accident. It is something we must fight for, every day, with everything we have. From his spot at the edge of the crowd, Judge Brennan listened intently. Samuel's words carried a weight that resonated deeply with him. For years, Brennan had viewed the courtroom as a place where the law was absolute, where his role was to uphold it without question. But Samuel's case had shown him the limits of that perspective. It had forced him to confront the humanity behind the cases he presided over, to see the people who were too often reduced to docket numbers and legal arguments. As Samuel continued to speak, Brennan thought back to the days following the case. The criticism he had faced from some of his colleagues had been harsh. They had accused him of overstepping, of allowing his emotions to cloud his judgment. But Brennan had stood firm. He had come to realize that impartiality did not mean indifference. True justice required compassion, empathy, and a willingness to adapt in the face of new truths. For Brennan, the decision to align himself with Samuel's cause had been as much about personal growth as it was about systemic reform. He had learned to ask the hard questions, to look beyond the surface of a case and consider its broader implications. And while his actions had earned him both allies and enemies, he knew in his heart that he had done the right thing. Samuel's voice rang out over the square. The reforms we've achieved so far are just the beginning. The changes to housing policies, the increased funding for shelters, and the new tenant protections are victories we should celebrate. But they are not the end of the road. There is still so much work to be done, so many voices that need to be heard, and so many lives that need to be uplifted. The crowd responded with applause, a wave of energy rippling through the square. Samuel smiled faintly, but his expression quickly turned serious again. I've learned that real change doesn't come from one person, one case, or one courtroom. It comes from all of us working together, holding each other accountable, and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. It comes from understanding that the law is not just a set of rules, but a tool we can use to build a better world. Among the crowd, reporters scribbled notes furiously, capturing Samuel's words. The story of a young barrister turned activist and the judge who had joined him in his fight for justice had captured the public's imagination. It was a story of redemption and transformation, of the power of individuals to challenge systems and create change. As Samuel finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped back from the podium, his shoulders visibly relaxing. Judge Brennan approached him, extending a hand. "Well said, Mr. Parker," Brennan said, his voice warm but firm. "You've become quite the orator." Samuel shook his hand, a wry smile playing on his lips. "I learned from the best," he replied, nodding toward the judge. For a moment they stood together in silence, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, a journey that had taken them from opposing sides of a courtroom to standing side by side as advocates for change. Brennan glanced at the crowd, then back at Samuel. "You've done something remarkable here," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Samuel's expression softened. "I couldn't have done it without you, Your Honor. You could have dismissed me, shut me down, Bo. You didn't. You listened. That's more than most would have done." Brennan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Perhaps. But you gave me something to listen to. Never forget that, Samuel. The power of your voice, of any voice, is only as strong as the courage behind it." As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel and Brennan remained for a while, speaking quietly about the road ahead. The reforms they had helped initiate were a good start, but both men knew the fight for justice was far from over. Samuel had plans to expand his workshops, to reach more communities, and to push for further policy changes. Brennan, for his part, intended to continue advocating for judicial reforms and using his position to challenge systemic injustices. Their partnership, born out of conflict, had become a symbol of what was possible when individuals from different walks of life came together with a shared purpose. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. As they parted ways, each man carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. For Samuel, it was the knowledge that his voice could make a difference. For Brennan, it was the understanding that justice required not just impartiality, but humanity. And for both, it was the certainty that their paths, though different, would always converge on the road to a fairer, more just world.